Lyra stood at the observation window of the Silverwood station and watched the stars shimmer in the endless darkness of space, while behind her, Ember dozed in the warm light of the artificial sun, his scales glowing like molten copper, and beside him, Frost breathed slowly, creating small clouds of frozen mist with each exhale, her ice-blue scales catching the light like diamonds scattered across snow. The elven woman had lived for 243 years, which was still young by the standards of her people, and in all that time she had bonded with her two dragons, learned the ancient ways of star navigation, and served as a guardian of the neutral zones where different species came to trade and talk without fear of war or violence. But something felt different today, and the dragons sensed it too, because both of them had been restless since dawn. Ember lifted his massive head and turned toward the viewport, his golden eyes focusing on something that Lyra could not yet see. And then Frost rose to her feet as well, her tail swishing back and forth in agitation, while small crystals of ice formed in the air around her body, creating a gentle tinkling sound like wind chimes made of frozen glass. Lyra reached out, with her mind touching the consciousness of both dragons through the ancient bond that linked them together, and what she felt made her heart race with alarm, because Ember sensed fire and destruction approaching, while Frost detected the cold emptiness of fear and desperation that came from beings who had lost everything they once held dear. The communication panel on the wall began to flash with urgent messages, and Lyra moved quickly to answer it while the dragons moved closer to her, their presence offering comfort and strength in whatever crisis was about to unfold before them all. The face that appeared on the screen belonged to Council Elder Theron, who looked more worried than Lyra had ever seen him in all her years of service, and his voice carried a tension that made her grip the edge of the console tighter as he spoke about unknown ships approaching the station at high speed, with damage to their hulls and distress signals broadcasting in multiple languages. Lyra asked what kind of ships they were and where they had come from, but Theron shook his head slowly and admitted that no one knew for certain, because the vessels were not from any of the registered species in their database, and the energy signatures were strange, mixing advanced technology with what appeared to be jury-rigged repairs done under extreme pressure and limited resources. The station sensors counted 15 ships in total, ranging from large colony vessels designed to carry thousands of people, to smaller military craft that bore the scars of recent combat with blast marks across their armor, and sections that had been welded shut to prevent atmosphere loss, and all of them were limping towards Silverwood Station like wounded animals seeking shelter from predators that still hunted them. Ember rumbled deep in his chest, and Lyra felt his desire to launch into space and investigate these strangers himself, because dragons were curious by nature and protective of those who needed help. But she placed a gentle hand on his massive shoulder and asked him to wait just a little longer until they knew whether these newcomers were friends or potential threats. The lead ship finally came close enough for visual contact, and Lyra found herself staring at a vessel that looked nothing like the elegant organic curves of elven design or the geometric precision of the other advanced races. Instead, it was all hard angles and practical construction built for function rather than beauty, with weapons mounted on every available surface and armor that appeared to have been replaced multiple times. A voice crackled through the communication system, speaking in a language that the translation matrix struggled to process at first, but eventually settled into words that Lyra could understand, though the accent was harsh and unfamiliar to her ears trained on the musical languages of the civilized galaxy. The speaker identified herself as Captain Laura Martinez of the Earth Colonial Fleet, and she requested emergency docking rights for her convoy, explaining that they were refugees fleeing from an enemy that had destroyed their home worlds and pursued them across half the galaxy with the intent of wiping out every last member of their species. Lyra felt a chill run down her spine because she had heard stories about species facing extinction, but had never actually encountered survivors of such a catastrophe, and the desperation in the human captain's voice was real enough to make even the most skeptical listener believe that these people had seen horrors beyond imagination. Elder Theron appeared on a split screen beside the human captain, and his face showed the internal debate that Lyra knew was happening among all the council members because granting sanctuary to refugees was one thing. But if these humans brought their war to Silverwood Station, then the elves would be drawn into a conflict that they had spent thousands of years avoiding. Captain Martinez seemed to sense the hesitation, and she began to speak faster, explaining that her people were not asking for military aid or demanding that the elves fight their battles for them, but simply requesting a safe place to land their wounded, and perhaps find shelter for the children and elderly who could not survive another jump through hyperspace without proper medical care. Frost moved closer to Lyra and pressed her cold snout against the elf's hand, and through their bond, Lyra felt the dragon's simple but powerful conviction that turning away beings in need was wrong regardless of the potential consequences, because honor meant something more than just protecting yourself and your own kind. Ember added his own feelings to the mix, reminding Lyra of the old codes that every dragon rider learned during their training about how strength came with responsibility, and those who possessed power had a duty to use it wisely in defense of the weak and helpless. Lyra took a deep breath and made a decision that she knew would change everything for herself and her people, because some choices could not be avoided, no matter how much easier it would be to simply close the doors and pretend that the suffering of strangers was not their concern. Opened a direct channel to the human captain and spoke clearly, so there would be no misunderstanding about what she was offering and what it might cost them all in the days to come, when the enemy that hunted these refugees finally caught up with their prey. Lyra told Captain Martinez that Silverwood Station would grant them emergency docking rights and provide medical care, food, and shelter for as long as they needed it. But she also warned that the council would want answers about who was chasing them and why, because the elves needed to understand exactly what kind of danger they were inviting through their doors. The relief on the human captain's face was visible even across the vast distance of space and through the grainy video transmission. And Laura Martinez thanked Lyra with tears streaming down her weathered face, while behind her, other humans began to cheer and embrace each other with the desperate joy of people who had not dared to hope that anyone would help them. As the human ships began their final approach to the docking bays, Lyra watched them come and wondered what stories these strangers would tell, and whether the elves would regret their kindness or find something worth protecting in these scarred survivors, who called themselves the last free humans of Earth. The human ships docked one by one in the vast bays of Silverwood Station, and Lyra watched through the security feeds as the airlocks opened to reveal people who looked exhausted beyond measure, with dark circles under their eyes and the kind of weariness that came not from physical labor but from months of constant fear and loss that wore down the spirit more than any amount of hard work ever could. Captain Laura Martinez was the first to step onto elven territory, and she moved with the careful discipline of someone who had commanded others through impossible situations. But Lyra could see the woman's hands trembling slightly as she looked around at the clean, bright corridors that had not been touched by war or destruction behind. Laura came a younger woman who introduced herself as Commander Amy Chen, and her eyes held a hardness that spoke of battles fought and friends lost, while she carried herself like a weapon that had been sharpened too many times and was now waiting for the next enemy to appear around every corner. Lyra met them in the crystal gardens where Ember and Frost waited among the flowering trees that grew under artificial sunlight, and she saw both humans stop in their tracks when they caught sight of the dragons, because even though humanity had reached the stars, they had apparently never encountered creatures quite like these before. Ember stretched his wings slowly, creating a span of nearly 30 meters of membrane and bone covered in scales that shimmered like molten metal in the light, and Frost raised her head to regard the newcomers with eyes that glowed pale blue, like ice, lit from within, while the temperature around her dropped several degrees. Laura took a step forward, despite the obvious fear that flickered across her face, and she bowed slightly in a gesture of respect that transcended cultural differences, while Amy's hand moved instinctively toward where a weapon would normally hang before she caught herself, and forced her arm back to her side. Lyra gestured for them to sit on the benches carved from living crystal that grew naturally in this part of the station. And once they were settled, she asked the question that the entire council wanted answered, which was who had attacked Earth and why these humans had been forced to flee their home with such devastating losses. Laura's face grew dark as she began to speak, and her voice carried the weight of memories that no one should have to bear as she told the story of how the Krell Dominion had arrived in Earth's system 6 months ago, with demands that humanity submit to their rule and provide tribute in the form of resources, technology, and a portion of their population to serve as workers in the Krell mining operations. The humans had refused because they had only recently gained their independence from another species that had tried to control them centuries before, and they had sworn never to bow to any master again, no matter the cost. And so they had prepared to defend themselves against an enemy that possessed superior numbers and weapons that could crack planets like eggs. Amy took over the narrative at this point, and her voice was flat and emotionless as she described the first battle at the edge of the solar system, where human ships had used every trick and tactic they could devise to slow down the Krell advance, while civilians evacuated from the outer colonies in a desperate rush to reach the inner worlds, where better defenses waited. The Krell had not expected resistance, and certainly not the kind of vicious creative fighting that humans brought to every engagement, because while the invaders had better technology, the defenders fought with a desperation, born of knowing that surrender meant slavery or death for everyone they loved. Lyra listened as Amy described battles fought in asteroid fields where human pilots used the terrain to ambush enemy formations and space stations that had been rigged to explode when the Krell tried to capture them, taking out entire squadrons in massive blasts that the invaders never saw coming, until it was too late. But even with all their courage and cunning, the humans could not stop an empire that controlled hundreds of worlds and possessed resources beyond counting. And so the Krell had pushed forward system by system, burning colonies and hunting down fleeing refugees with a methodical cruelty that suggested they enjoyed the chase more than the actual conquest. Laura's voice cracked as she told Lyra about the last stand at Mars, where thousands of ships, both military and civilian, had gathered to buy time for the final evacuation of Earth itself, and how those brave crews had held the line for 3 days against impossible odds, knowing that none of them would survive, but determined to save as many lives as they could. Ember growled low in his throat, and Lyra felt through their bond that the dragon was angry on behalf of these strangers, who had fought so hard to protect their own kind, because dragons understood loyalty and sacrifice better than most creatures in the galaxy, and the idea of an enemy that would destroy an entire species simply for refusing to submit offended every instinct that Ember possessed. Frost moved closer to Amy, and the commander tensed for a moment before relaxing slightly, as the ice dragon gently touched her snout to the human's shoulder, in a gesture that needed no translation because comfort was universal. Regardless of what language or species one belonged to, Amy reached up with a shaking hand and touched Frost's scales, marveling at how cold they felt, and how the dragon's presence seemed to draw away some of the pain and grief that the commander had been carrying for months without any chance to properly mourn the losses she had suffered. Lyra asked how many humans had escaped, and Laura's answer made the elf's heart sink, because out of billions who had lived in the solar system, only about 3 million had made it out on the colony ships and military vessels that had survived the fighting. And even now the Krell were hunting down scattered groups, trying to eliminate every last trace of humanity from the galaxy. The human. Captain explained that they had been running for weeks, jumping from system to system and fighting running battles, whenever the Krell caught up with them, while their supplies dwindled and their ships sustained damage that could not be fully repaired, without access to proper facilities and trained engineers. Laura looked directly at Lyra and asked if the elves had any idea what it was like to watch your home burn from orbit while you ran away because there was nothing else you could do, and the elf had to admit that no, she could not truly understand that kind of loss because the Silverwood had been neutral for so long that war was something they read about in history texts, not something they lived through. But Lyra also understood that neutrality came with a cost, and watching suffering without acting to prevent it was its own kind of moral failure, and she could feel through her bond with Ember and Frost that both dragons agreed with her growing conviction that the elves could not simply offer temporary shelter and then send these refugees back out into the void to be hunted down and destroyed. Amy asked what would happen now, and whether the council would allow the humans to stay, or if they would be forced to move on before the Krell found them here and brought war to Silverwood Station, along with death and destruction that would shatter the peace that the elves had maintained for thousands of years. Lyra stood and walked to the edge of the garden, where she could see out into space through the transparent dome overhead. And she thought about all the years of peace and prosperity that her people had enjoyed while other species fought and died in conflicts that the elves had chosen to ignore. She turned back to face the two human women and told them that she could not speak for the entire council, but she would use every bit of influence she possessed to convince her people that some things were worth fighting for, and that if the Krell came looking for their prey, then they would find dragons waiting for them along with elves who had finally remembered that power, without purpose, was just another form of cowardice. Laura and Amy looked at each other with expressions of disbelief and hope mixed together because they had not dared to imagine that anyone would be willing to stand with them against an enemy as powerful as the Krell Dominion. But here was this elf woman with her magnificent dragons promising to risk everything to defend strangers she had only just met. Ember roared his agreement, and Frost added her own call, creating a harmony that echoed through the crystal gardens and out across the station, where other elves heard it and wondered what it meant that the dragons were singing their battle song for the first time in centuries. The Silverwood Council gathered in the great chamber where decisions affecting their entire civilization had been made for 3,000 years, and the circular room was carved from a single massive crystal that caught the light from 100 different angles, creating rainbows that danced across the walls like living things that shifted and moved with every breath of air. Lyra stood in the center of the chamber, with Ember and Frost flanking her on either side, and around them sat the 12 elders who represented the different clans and territories that made up their society. And each of those ancient faces showed concern and uncertainty, because they all knew what was at stake in the discussion they were about to have. Elder Theron spoke first, as was his right as the oldest member of the council, and he laid out the situation with careful precision, explaining that the human refugees had brought their war to Silverwood Station, and that allowing them to stay might draw the wrath of the Krell Dominion down upon a people who had successfully avoided major conflicts for longer than most species had existed. Elder Kira, who led the northern clans, argued that the elves had no obligation to risk their lives for strangers, especially when those strangers came from a species that the Silverwood had never even heard of before today, and she pointed out that humanity's fight with the Krell was not their concern, and getting involved would set a dangerous precedent that could drag them into every war that happened in the galaxy. Several other council members nodded their agreement, and Lyra felt her heart sink because she had known this would not be easy, but hearing her own people argue for abandoning refugees who had nowhere else to go made her question whether the Silverwood had lost something important during their long years of peace and isolation. Elder Darian, who was known for his wisdom and fair judgment, raised his hand to speak, and he reminded the council that their ancestors had bonded with dragons not for power or glory, but because both species believed in protecting those who could not protect themselves, and he asked whether 3,000 years of peace had made them forget the principles that had guided their people through darker times. Ember shifted his weight, and a low rumble came from deep in his chest that was not quite a growl, but carried a clear message of displeasure at the direction the conversation was taking, and several elders looked nervously at the massive dragon, because they remembered stories of what happened when star dragons became angry. Lyra stepped forward and asked permission to speak, and when Theron nodded, she began to tell the council everything she had learned from Laura and Amy about the Krell invasion and the desperate running battle that had cost humanity its homeworld and billions of lives in a conflict that had no purpose except conquest and domination. She described the last stand at Mars, where human ships had fought, knowing they would die but determined to buy time for others to escape. And she spoke about the refugees sleeping in cold storage on ships that were falling apart because there was nowhere safe for them to go and no one willing to help them against an enemy that wanted to erase their entire species from existence. Elder Kira interrupted to ask why the humans had not simply surrendered and accepted Krell rule if their situation was so desperate, and Lyra felt anger flash through her at the question, because it showed a fundamental misunderstanding of what it meant to value freedom over survival. Frost moved closer to Lyra and pressed her cold snout against the elf's hand, offering comfort and strength through their bond, while Ember spread his wings slightly in a gesture that every dragon rider recognized as a sign of readiness to fight if necessary. Lyra explained that humans were what the Krell called Deathworlders, meaning they came from a planet so harsh and dangerous that it had shaped them into survivors who refused to give up, even when faced with impossible odds, and that this stubbornness, this refusal to accept defeat, was not a weakness, but perhaps the most valuable quality any species could possess. She told the council about how human pilots had used asteroid fields and debris clouds to ambush enemy formations, about how they had rigged space stations to explode and turned cargo ships into weapons, and fought with a creativity and desperation that had cost the Krell far more casualties than they had expected. From what they thought would be an easy conquest, Elder Darien asked what Lyra thought the Silverwood should do, and she took a deep breath before answering, because she knew her next words would either convince the council or doom the humans to face their enemy alone, without any allies to stand beside them. Lyra said that she believed the elves had a choice between maintaining their comfortable neutrality and watching innocent beings die, or taking a stand for something that mattered and risking everything they had built to defend people who had no one else to turn to. And she admitted that the second option was dangerous and might bring war to their doorstep, but the first option would cost them something far more valuable than safety. She spoke about honor and duty and the old codes that dragon riders swore to uphold, and she reminded the council that their power came with responsibility, and that choosing not to act when you had the ability to prevent suffering was itself a choice that carried moral weight. Elder Kira stood and argued that Lyra was being naive and emotional, and that the survival of the Silverwood people had to take priority over helping strangers, no matter how sympathetic their story might be. And she said that if the Krell were powerful enough to destroy humanity, then the elves would stand no chance against them either. But Elder Darien countered by pointing out that the Krell had only defeated humanity through overwhelming numbers, and that the humans had proven that they could fight effectively against superior technology when they used tactics that their enemies did not expect. And he suggested that an alliance between human creativity and elven technology supported by dragons might be more formidable than anyone imagined. The debate continued for hours, with some council members arguing for caution and others supporting Lyra's position, that they had a moral obligation to help, and throughout it all Ember and Frost remained at her side, their presence a reminder that dragons had always valued courage over comfort and action over empty words. Nali, Elder Theron, called for silence and said that the council needed to make a decision because the human refugees could not wait forever, and the Krell fleet was probably already searching for them and would eventually track them to Silverwood Station, whether the elves helped or. Nada pointed out that refusing to shelter the humans would not protect the Silverwood from becoming targets, because the Krell would see their station as having aided the refugees even temporarily, and would likely attack anyway to punish them for that assistance, however brief it had been. This argument seemed to sway several of the undecided council members, because if they were going to face Krell aggression, regardless of what they chose, then it made more sense to at least gain the gratitude and alliance of the humans rather than earning everyone's enmity by turning away people in desperate need. Lyra held her breath as the council prepared to vote, knowing that everything hung on this moment, and that the fate of 3 million human refugees depended on whether 12 elven elders could find the courage to risk their comfortable existence for strangers who had nothing to offer except their determination to survive. Elder Theron asked each council member to cast their vote, and as hands were raised for or against offering full sanctuary and military protection to the humans, Lyra felt Ember and Frost both tense beside her, because the dragons understood just as well as she did how important this decision was. A final count was 7 in favor and 5 against, which meant that the motion passed by the slimmest possible margin. But it was enough, and Lyra felt tears of relief stream down her face, because her people had chosen to stand for something greater than their own safety. Elder Darien smiled at her and said that she should inform the human captain that Silverwood Station would offer them full sanctuary, and that the elves would prepare to defend their new allies against whatever forces the Krell sent to reclaim their escaped prey. As Lyra left the council chamber with Ember and Frost walking beside her, she knew that she had just changed the course of history for both their species, and that the easy, peaceful days were over. But she also felt a sense of rightness and purpose that had been missing from her life before these desperate refugees had arrived seeking help. The war was coming whether they wanted it or not, and now at least the humans would not have to face it alone, because they had found allies who believed that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible, and the cost might be everything they had. Laura Martinez stood in the command center of the New Hope and stared at the tactical displays that showed Silverwood Station from every angle. while beside her Amy Chen worked with a team of elven technicians to integrate human and elven defense systems into something that might actually give them a fighting chance when the Krell finally arrived. The news that the Council had voted to protect them had spread through the human refugees like wildfire, and for the first time in months, people were smiling and laughing instead of just staring into space with the hollow eyes of those who had lost everything. And Laura felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had been carrying since the day Earth burned, but she also knew that gratitude was not enough, and that if the elves were going to risk their lives for humanity, then the humans needed to do everything possible to make sure that sacrifice was not wasted. And so she had gathered every pilot, engineer, and tactical officer who could still function after months of running and fighting to begin preparing for the battle that was surely coming. Lyra entered the command center with Ember and Frost following close behind, and the dragons had to fold their wings tight against their bodies to fit through the doorways that had been designed for beings much smaller than 30-meter-long reptiles, covered in scales that glowed with inner fire and ice. The elf approached the holographic display where Amy was showing the elven technicians how human ships fought in three-dimensional space using maneuvers that looked reckless and chaotic, but were actually carefully calculated to exploit weaknesses in enemy formations. And Laura saw the respect growing in the eyes of the elves as they realized that these refugees were not helpless victims, but experienced warriors who had survived against impossible odds. Amy pointed to the long-range sensors and explained that they had maybe 3 days before the Krell tracking. Ships found them because humanity had learned the hard way that the enemy was relentless and methodical in hunting down anyone who escaped their initial attacks. And she showed them recordings of previous battles where Krell forces had followed, human ships across multiple star systems refusing to give up until every last target was destroyed. One of the elven engineers asked how the Krell were able to track them so effectively, and Amy's expression grew dark as she explained that the enemy had captured several human ships early in the war and reverse-engineered their drives, which meant they could now follow the unique energy signatures that human vessels left in hyperspace. Like bloodhounds following a scent trail, Lyra studied the tactical information with growing concern, because while the Silverwood had advanced weapons and shields, their people had not fought a real war in thousands of years, and most of the current generation had never experienced actual combat, while the Krell were seasoned conquerors who had subjugated dozens of species and knew exactly how to break defensive positions. Laura seemed to read the worry in Lyra's face, and the human captain moved closer to explain that the elves had advantages the Krell would not expect because the enemy had grown arrogant after centuries of easy victories, and they relied on overwhelming force rather than clever tactics, which meant that speed and unpredictability could level the playing field, she proposed. A strategy that made several of the elven officers gasp in shock, because it involved using the station itself as bait, while human fighters and dragon riders launched from hidden positions to attack the Krell fleet from multiple angles at once, catching them between the station's heavy guns and mobile strike forces that could hit and run before the enemy could respond effectively. Amy added that they should mine the approaches to the station with proximity explosives disguised as debris, and set up false sensor readings to make the Krell think they were facing a smaller force than actually existed. And every trick they could use to confuse and delay the enemy would buy them precious time to inflict maximum damage. Ember rumbled his approval of this plan, because dragons appreciated cunning and strategy as much as raw strength, and Frost moved closer to the holographic display, her ice-blue eyes studying the projected battle formations with an intelligence that reminded everyone in the room that these creatures were not simple animals but thinking beings, with thousands of years of combat experience encoded in their genetic memory. The next 2 days passed in a blur of activity as human engineers worked alongside elven technicians to upgrade weapon systems and reinforce shields while pilots from both species trained together, learning how to coordinate their very different fighting styles into something that could function as a unified force. Lyra spent hours each day flying with Ember and Frost through the training simulations that Amy had designed, and she discovered that fighting beside human pilots required her to think differently because they took risks that no elf would consider sane, using momentum and gravity in ways that seemed to violate basic physics but somehow worked. She watched as a human pilot named Katie Rodriguez threw her fighter into a spin that should have torn the ship apart, but instead allowed her to dodge 3 enemy missiles while simultaneously firing on a target behind her. And when Lyra asked how she had learned that maneuver, Katie just grinned and said that growing up on a death world taught you to use every possible advantage no matter how crazy it looked. The human refugees who were not pilots or soldiers also contributed to the preparations in ways that surprised the elves because they had skills in manufacturing and repair that came from living on worlds where resources were scarce and nothing could be wasted, and they began improving the station's systems with modifications that increased efficiency by margins the elves had not thought possible. Laura found Lyra in the Crystal Gardens on the evening of the second day, and the human captain sat down beside the elf without saying anything for several minutes, just looking up at the stars through the transparent dome, while Ember and Frost dozed nearby, their breathing slow and steady. Finally, Laura spoke, and her voice was quiet as she thanked Lyra for convincing her people to help humanity, because she knew how much the elves were risking, and how easily this could end with Silverwood Station burning just like Earth had burned. And she wanted Lyra to know that the humans would fight with everything they had to make sure that did not happen. Lyra reached over and took Laura's hand in her own and told the captain that she was not afraid of dying if it meant standing up for what was right, and that the elves had spent too long hiding behind their neutrality while others suffered, and maybe this war would cost them everything. But at least they would face the end, knowing they had chosen honor over comfort. Laura smiled sadly and said that she hoped it would not come to that. But if it did, then at least they would go down fighting side by side, which was more than most species could say when they faced extinction. And she admitted that meeting the elves and their dragons had given her back something she thought she had lost when Earth fell, which was hope that there was still good in the galaxy worth protecting. The alarm sirens began wailing before either of them could say anything else, and Amy's voice came over the station-wide communication system announcing that long-range sensors had detected multiple Krell ships dropping out of hyperspace at the edge of the system and moving toward them at high speed with weapons already charging. Lyra and Laura ran toward the command center, while Ember and Frost launched themselves into the air, their wings spreading wide as they flew toward the dragon launching bays, where other riders were already mounting their partners and preparing for battle. The command center was organized chaos when they arrived, with elven officers calling out sensor readings while human tacticians plotted intercept courses and coordinated the defensive positions they had spent 2 days preparing. And on the main display, the Krell fleet appeared as dozens of red icons, growing larger with every passing second. Amy looked up from her console and reported that preliminary scans showed 43 enemy warships, including several heavy cruisers and at least one dreadnought, which was the largest class of vessel the Krell possessed capable of cracking a planet's crust with sustained bombardment. The enemy fleet commander opened a communication channel, and his face appeared on the screen with features that reminded Laura of a predatory bird, all sharp angles, and cold eyes that held no mercy or compassion. And he spoke in a voice that expected instant obedience as he demanded that the station surrender the human refugees immediately or face complete destruction. Laura stepped forward and told the Krell commander that Silverwood Station was offering sanctuary to the humans under the ancient laws of refugee protection, and that any attack on the station would be considered an act of war against the Silverwood people and their allies. The Krell commander laughed as if he had heard the funniest joke in the galaxy, and he replied that the station had 1 hour to comply before his fleet began firing, and that he had destroyed civilizations far older and more powerful than these elves and their primitive dragons. Lyra moved beside Laura and spoke directly to the enemy commander, telling him that he was welcome to try, but that he would discover that neither humans nor elves nor dragons were as easy to kill as he seemed to think, and that his fleet would pay a heavy price for every meter of space they tried to take. The Krell fleet advanced in perfect formation, with their ships arranged in a pattern that had conquered 100 worlds, and their commanders felt confident that this would be just another easy victory against primitives who did not understand the futility of resisting an empire that spanned half the galaxy. Lyra sat astride Ember's back, with her hands gripping the riding harness, while beside her, Frost flew with another rider named Kale, who had volunteered to fight even though he had not seen combat since his training days centuries ago. And behind them 12 more dragons launched from the station, each carrying an elven warrior who had decided that peace without honor was not worth maintaining. The human fighters formed up, in loose formations that looked chaotic to the Krell sensors, but were actually carefully designed to allow maximum flexibility, and Katie Rodriguez led her squadron on a wide arc around the enemy fleet, while staying just outside their weapon range and waiting for the signal to attack. Amy coordinated the defense from the command center, with her fingers dancing across multiple control panels as she tracked the movements of every friendly ship and calculated firing solutions for the stations. Heavy weapons, while beside her, elven officers called out ranges and shield status in voices that stayed remarkably calm, considering they were about to face their first real battle. The Krell dreadnought fired first, sending a massive energy beam that lit up space like a miniature sun, and the blast struck the station's shields with enough force to make the entire structure shudder. But the combined human and elven engineering held firm, and the shield generators absorbed the impact without failing. Laura gave the order to return fire, and the station's weapons came online all at once, sending dozens of plasma bolts and missile volleys toward the enemy fleet, while the Krell ships adjusted their formations and prepared to weather what they assumed would be weak and ineffective resistance. But the Krell had never fought dragons before, and they were completely unprepared when Ember and Frost and their kin dove toward the fleet from above, using the glare of the system's sun to mask their approach until they were almost on top of the enemy ships. Ember opened his massive jaws and breathed a stream of plasma so hot that it melted through the armor of a Krell cruiser like a torch through wax, and the ship broke apart in a cascade of explosions that sent debris spinning in every direction, while Frost followed up with her freezing breath that created fields of absolute zero temperature, causing hull metal to become brittle and shatter under the stress of thermal shock. The Krell fleet reeled in confusion because their sensors had not been designed to track living creatures in the vacuum of space, and the dragons moved with an agility that no mechanical ship could match, twisting and turning through the gaps in enemy formations while breathing fire and ice that destroyed everything they touched. Katie and her squadron chose that moment to attack from the flanks, diving in fast and hard, with guns blazing and missiles launching in rapid succession, and the human pilots flew like maniacs, performing maneuvers that violated every safety regulation ever written, but allowed them to dodge enemy fire while landing hits on vulnerable points that Amy had identified during the preparation phase. The battle turned into a swirling chaos of ships and dragons and energy weapons that lit up the darkness of space with colors that had never been seen in this system before, and the Krell commanders tried desperately to regain control of the situation, but every time they thought they understood the enemy's tactics, something new and unexpected happened. Lyra guided Ember through a gap between two Krell destroyers and felt the heat of their weapons' fire passing close enough to singe the dragon's scales. But Ember was too fast and too experienced to be caught by such clumsy attacks, and he twisted sideways to bring his tail around in a strike that crushed the sensor array of one ship, leaving it blind and vulnerable. A human fighter piloted by a young man named Carlos Bennett swooped in to finish the job, putting 3 missiles into the disabled destroyer's engines, and the ship exploded in a fireball that briefly illuminated Carlos's grinning face before he accelerated away to find his next target. The Krell dreadnought tried to target the dragons with its point defense systems, but the creatures were too small and too fast for weapons designed to hit capital ships, and when the dreadnought's captain ordered his vessel to move closer to the station, hoping to use its superior firepower to break through the shields, he made a fatal mistake. Amy had been waiting for exactly this moment, and she triggered the proximity mines that the humans and elves had scattered throughout the approach vector disguised as ordinary space debris, and the dreadnought flew directly into a field of explosions that tore through its forward shields and damaged its main weapons. Laura ordered all available firepower to concentrate on the wounded dreadnought and the station's heavy guns, combined with missiles from human ships and plasma breath from dragons, to hammer the massive vessel until its shields collapsed entirely, and secondary explosions began rippling through its hull. The Krell commander appeared on the communication channel again, and this time his face showed shock and fear instead of arrogance, as he watched his supposedly invincible fleet being torn apart by an enemy he had dismissed as primitive and weak, and he began to issue retreat orders while his ships tried desperately to disengage from the battle. But the humans and elves and dragons were not content to simply drive off the attackers, because they knew that if the Krell escaped, they would return with even larger forces, and so they pressed their advantage, hunting down fleeing ships and making sure that the enemy paid the highest possible price for their aggression. Ember caught a Krell cruiser that was trying to reach the hyperspace jump point and he breathed fire into its engines until they exploded, taking half the ship with them while Frost worked with Kale to freeze the weapons systems of another vessel, allowing human fighters to disable it with precision strikes that left the crew alive but the ship helpless. The battle lasted 7 hours of continuous fighting that pushed everyone to their absolute limits and tested every bit of courage and skill that the defenders possessed. But when it finally ended, the Krell fleet was broken with more than half their ships destroyed, and the rest limping away with damage that would take months to repair. Lyra brought Ember back to the station, and she was so exhausted that she could barely climb down from the dragons. But when her feet touched the landing platform, she looked up to see Laura and Amy waiting for her, with tears streaming down their faces. The three women embraced without speaking, because words were not necessary after what they had been through. Together and around them, human and elven warriors were doing the same thing, celebrating their survival and mourning the friends who had not made it through the battle. The casualties had been lighter than anyone dared hope, with only 15 fighters lost and 2 dragons wounded, but even those losses felt heavy, because each one represented a person who had given everything to protect others, and their sacrifice would not be forgotten. In the days that followed, the news of the battle spread across the galaxy faster than light itself, traveling through the communication networks of 100 different species. And everywhere the story was told, people began to ask themselves whether they had been wrong to remain neutral while empires like the Krell conquered and enslaved whoever they wished. Other refugee groups began arriving at Silverwood Station, seeking sanctuary and protection, and behind them came representatives from neutral species who wanted to learn how such a small force had defeated a Krell fleet, and whether it might be possible to stand together against tyranny, instead of hoping that appeasement would keep them safe. Laura stood with Lyra in the Crystal Gardens weeks after the battle, and watched new dragons being born in the breeding caves that the elves had opened for the first time in centuries, because they realized that they would need more riders if they were going to help defend all the refugees who kept arriving. The human captain said that she never imagined when they fled Earth that they would find not just sanctuary, but a true home and allies who were willing to risk everything for beings they barely knew. And she asked Lyra if the elf had any regrets about the choice she had made that day in the council chamber. Lyra smiled and reached up to touch Ember's snout as the great dragon lowered his head to nuzzle against her hand. And she said that she had no regrets at all, because for the first time in her long life she felt like she was doing something that truly mattered, and that the future they were building together was worth any price they had to pay. Amy joined them with reports that 3 more species had formally requested to join what people were now calling the Free Alliance, and that the Krell Dominion had suffered a major political crisis when their other subject races saw what happened at Silverwood and began to question whether their masters were as invincible as they claimed. The 3 women looked out at the stars and knew that the war was far from over, and that many more battles would have to be fought before the galaxy was truly safe. But they also knew that they had proven something important, which was that courage was contagious, and that when free beings stood together, they could accomplish things that seemed impossible.